Hello, and welcome to another episode of Such a Nightmare Conversations about Horror. My name is Katherine Troyer, and I'm so excited to get to be talking today with Toni Tresca.
Hey there.
This is a podcast where the horrifically nerdy meets the terrifyingly academic, as we explore that fine line between the horrific and the horrible. Each episode looks at a specific horror text that is, for better or worse, giving us nightmares.
And we are so excited to have you join us today for our discussion of Alfred Hitchcock's 1960 film, Psycho.
I've seen Psycho several times. I took a class in grad school that was on Alfred Hitchcock. Although, if I remember correctly, Psycho was not one of the films we did because the professor was like, "You've probably seen it. We're doing some of his other things." But you had never seen Psycho before.
Yeah, if that film professor had done that to me, I guess I just would have missed out on seeing Psycho for a little longer.
Yeah.
I had not seen Psycho until we decided to do an episode on it. You and I had talked about it before, and you had warned me explicitly to avoid the Vince Vaughn version.
Yes. Yeah, there are interesting things happening with Gus Van Sant's remake in terms of it as a thought experiment, because it's a near shot-by-shot identical film.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many ways in which that version is just not okay. And honestly, to be perfectly honest, 95% of it comes down to Anthony Perkins. I adore him. I just think he's so handsome. And I know I would be murdered by him because I would just be like, "Oh, you want to take me out on the town?" He just does such a good job in the performance, his embodiment, everything about him is to me Norman Bates. And so I think that anyone else, but maybe particularly Vince Vaughn, wouldn't have done it for me.
Before we get into our larger conversation of Psycho, let's talk briefly about the plot of Psycho. Although, unless you're like me, I guess we can't assume everyone has seen it, because until this, I had not seen it myself.
It's true.
If you hadn't seen it, there are obviously going to be massive spoilers ahead.
Yes.
We will definitely be spoiling the whole plot, I believe.
100%.
And
start to finish.
Here's a little overview in case you hadn't seen it but want to keep listening.
Or saw it long enough ago that you just don't remember every single minute.
So it starts with real estate clerk Marion Crane, who is with her boyfriend, Sam Loomis, but they're unable to get married because he's coming off of a really bad divorce. Marion comes to work and suddenly becomes in possession of $40,000 that was entrusted to her to deposit. However, Marianne does not deposit this $40,000 at the bank. Instead, she uses $700 to get a used car and goes on the run, stopping at the Bates Motel, where she encounters a dashing and charming, yet weird and isolated Norman Bates, and some psycho things start occurring.
You were savoring that, weren't you?
I was really happy. I didn't know exactly how I was going to end it, but I was glad when I was able to find a way to pun off the title.
Yeah. I'm sure that you felt like, the heavens opened, the sun shone down on you. This was a film that you had suggested because I always resist a little bit the notion of categorizing this film as horror.
Mm-hmm.
And there's several reasons for that. And I feel like, and I couldn't talk about most of them because it's more of a feeling than an issue of plot. But now that you've had a chance to see the film, would you classify this as horror? Or would you classify this as something else entirely? Or would you say that it is in some sort of liminal space where it is, it's the Schrodinger's cat version of horror, where it is both simultaneously horror and not horror?
I'm thinking it's probably going to have to be some element of in between there, because it certainly is using a lot of horror and created a lot of these horror tropes that have subsequently been seen over and over again. We were talking briefly before we started recording this podcast about how interesting it was for me to watch this film, having understood Psycho only from like a cultural zeitgeist perspective and like the tropes of it, like the knife in the shower, the music, kind of some of the shots of the hotel, this creepy atmospheric nature that really does kind of reduce it down to these more horror elements that have since been perpetuated over and over again by other horror films and other things that would later go on. But also, a lot of it itself is focused on this more human element, which does make me kind of gravitate more to maybe like a psychological thriller element, but it certainly has and has created horror elements and tropes that have been used over and over again. So it's interesting.
Yeah, it does sort of, it's interesting to think about there being the potential for something to be the sort of grandfather of a genre without fitting completely in the genre itself.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's even got the, like, who should be punished and why. That initial shot where we see Marion in her brassiere, right?
Right.
I mean, it's like, oh, well, guess she has to die at some point because she must be a whore, right? That there's that. I mean, that is not me. That is 100% the reaction that people had based on, like, they were concerned about needing to censor it. This was scandalous. This is one of the first times that we saw somebody in their underthings, particularly in their underthings, in the middle of the day with their non-husband in a film.
Right.
And the fact that that person ends up being the one who, quote, has to die, as opposed to the more virginal and innocent Lila. I mean, definitely this film is giving us the building blocks to make the genre, even if it's not using them to be within the genre itself.
Even in what you've just described is the bare bones of the final girl plot. Of course, that plot is kind of shoved over into the B storyline and doesn't really actualize itself until a little bit later into the second act. But it is still the core frameworks of this final girl. Like, there's another one that has to die, and then after that, because of this tragedy that she endures, they'll rise up and they'll find the answers to everything that's going on.
And Carol Clover, in her chapter on the slasher film, not in the part on the final girl, but on the part on the killer, references Norman Bates, right? That's one of her examples that she's using to explain how the killer is complex and complicated and has, all of these sort of like psychological elements to unpack. So even as early as, again, some of our sort of formative horror scholarship, people are referencing this film. I think for me, the reason that I will never be able to say that it is the very least exclusively horror is for two reasons. One, while I think it is technically possible to make a horror film without meaning to make a horror film, I think that intention is a key element of the genre, right? What does horror do? It has as its intended affect to horrify you, and that's a terrible definition, but it nevertheless stands that, there needs to be an intention to horrify. And I think that the intention here is more to thrill, right? And to sort of titillate as opposed to be expressive horror. My other problem is where some people have gone with this in terms of trying to make it be horror. And that is that a lot of people have tried to talk about, and the word that they use is the word that the film uses, right? That idea of the transvestite. And, the fact that this is about oppression and repression and all of that stuff. And so first off, there's just the part that all of that's dated in terms of terminology, right? So, and also inaccurate because he's not doing it based on that definition for sexual pleasure, right? There's like, so I have problems with how traditionally and historically some people have tried to make this fit into the horror genre by focusing or emphasizing elements that I'm not sure are quite accurate readings.
Yeah, because I think in order for it to be this horror film, you really do have to be totally disgusted and appalled entirely by Norman Bates, rather than understanding this like incredible trauma that they went through, and then also understanding that is the other traumatic event that they inflicted on themselves and this delusion that they have built for themselves and constructed. Yeah, I think it's a lot more complicated than just maybe some of the simpler framings that it often gets lumped through to make it fit with the larger horror genre that this film, as you mentioned, was clearly not intended to necessarily sweetly fall into. It's not like there wasn't horror films or literature around in the 60s. when
Yeah.
Alfred Hitchcock was around. So he clearly could have played more into those genre elements. So I think that it's right. You're right in highlighting that intentionality as being a thing that prevents it from entirely. Yeah.
And I would argue that the book by Bloch actually probably does fit more within the horror genre because in large part of how the book frames it, right? So the movie starts with Marion, and she is the person we're focusing on. You know, Norman is sort of secondary, and then it's Lila and Sam, and again, Norman's sort of secondary or tertiary even to Mother. But in Bloch's book, it starts with Norman, right? And it's not first person narration, but you are sort of sitting in his skin, so to speak. And that's what makes it uncomfortable, right?
Right.
Because as it progresses, you're like, ooh, oh, no, I was like with him while he was being gross and creepy, and he was always gross and creepy.
Right.
And that's an element that I think Hitchcock and crew purposefully took away from the film.
Right. Which is why, like, I guess a more explicit horror example of something like this would be something more like American Psycho, like, which is a clear articulation off of this, where it does play into more of those generic understandings of horror. And so, yeah.
The scholarship I want to reference, though, because I do want to talk about scholarship, because unsurprisingly, there's a ton on Psycho.
What?
Yeah, I know. Isn't that like wild, considering their entire books written just on Hitchcock and their entire books written on Psycho too. But I did want to reference some scholarship that situates Psycho within the horror genre that I think is actually making a very strong case and does reveal that, like you said, right, it may not be exclusively horror, but it is nevertheless the foundation of where we're going to be going next. And so this comes from someone we've talked about before on the show, because she's one of my favorite horror scholars. Her name is Bernice M. And her, to this day, out of all the conferences I've ever been to, her talk on The Shining and the Wendigo elements remains one of the few presentations I remember, right? Like it blew my mind. And so she has several books that are looking at various elements of American Gothic, but this one is called the Highway Horror Film. And she has a chapter called I Almost Drove Right Past Motels and Highway Horror. And her argument is that Psycho is a foundational text in the highway horror subgenre, and she has very specific reasons for making that claim. But I feel like already you should be like, yep, no, that makes sense.
Yeah.
She says that there are these things, the things that you mentioned, Toni, right? That like we can see them in films like Identity or Bug or The Helpers or the countless other horror films where at some point somebody makes a mistake and takes an exit to a terrible, terrible, terrible motel. So she begins her chapter by talking about the motel as something to be thinking about in both the decades since the release of Psycho, but also sort of before, because her entire argument, the larger argument of this book, is that the highways that we built in America changed everything in some incredibly profound ways, because they literally and figuratively changed our landscape. And so she says that post-Psycho, the motel is this place in which, and specifically motel, right, in which unwary travelers are subjected to hideous acts of violence. And she says, if these films tell us anything, it is that places of sanctuary are prone to catastrophic inversion, to becoming demonic places, spaces of objection, derangement, violence, and horror. And she references the theorist Derrida and says that Derrida actually reminds us the word hospitality is a really tricksy word, because embedded in it is the word hostility, right? The sort of like the undesirable guest. So there's this way in which motels are just highlighting the fact that there's always a sense of uncomfortableness between the idea of going somewhere else that is not your home to stay, and going through the sort of rituals of like getting your key and having a bed, but it's a bed other people have slept in, but it's now your bed for at least the night, and what that does for the genre. So her main argument is that there are these things that Hitchcock is doing in Psycho that are setting us up to understand the highway horror, or more specifically the motel horror subgenre. And a lot of it comes down to issues of privacy, right? And we've talked about this before, and we talked about this with like American Psycho, right? That American Psycho asks us to remember that we are voyeurs,
Hmm.
and so does Psycho, right? It reminds us that we are watching her just as much as Norman is. In fact, even more so
Hmm.
because our peephole is bigger.
Yeah, he eventually also does put the picture back up and stop watching. Whereas in that moment, we literally the camera just goes right back to her, where we continue actively watching. And I think that separation, that concept of voyeurism and active versus passive thing, is something that is really interesting and constant throughout this film. Always, like Norman in that interesting conversation between him and Marion when they're surrounded by the birds, and he's talking about why he likes the birds so much, and he projects this passiveness onto these birds that aren't there, and it's just interesting, this difference between, and this role that the film suggests in like the ways that we view passive versus active behaviors in ourselves and the people around us. And that voyeurism is one way into that initial overarching theme that we see over and over.
What I really like about what you just said is that you mentioned, you built for us a dichotomy, right? With passive on one side and active on the other. And part of what Murphy is arguing is that films that feature motels, and indeed the concept of motels, particularly post World War II motels, is constantly defeating these and breaking down these binaries, because
Mm-hmm.
most of the time the motel owners, like in the case of Psycho, lived there, right?
Right.
So it was both a place of business and their home. It was both a public place and a private place. It was both familiar because it looks like every other motel, but unfamiliar because you probably hadn't been there. It is a destination, but it is out of the way, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
this is what Psycho does so masterfully, and this is why I'm willing to say without a doubt, whether or not it is a horror film, it is the foundation for where we would be going, because it's reminding us of how uncomfortable we are with things that we can't put neatly into boxes.
Yeah, and that's exactly what that initial conversation is. They establish a whole bunch of these like really clear frameworks, or I guess it's not their initial conversation. It's when they're eating, she's eating the sandwiches and milk, which is should have been the first sign right there. Who's
Yeah.
offering you milk for dinner?
Actually, I feel very much the same way, but I was talking to someone the other day that said that their person did that they had a big cup of milk for dinner every night, and I mean, and this person's in like their 40s or 50s, and I was like, "Oh, okay, that's not what I would have done," but that's, I mean, so yes, but I'm with you that like that's a gentle warning sign.
I, for one, certainly would have declined the milk with my sandwich if I was in that position.
Well, I know what I'm offering you the next time. I'm gonna be like, drink this milk, Tony.
And then that's when I'll know something is awry there.
Okay, so that will be my like signal that you need to run, right? So the next time, if ever I'm kidnapped and held hostage and have to invite you over, the next time, like there's ever been a first time. If that ever happens, I will offer you milk, and then you will know that you need to go call 911. That is our plan of action. The last thing I just kind of want to quickly reference, and I'm about to slaughter a French last name because there's a reason I chose to study German instead, because German pronounces every letter and French pretends that most letters don't exist. So apologies ahead of time for slaughtering this person's name. But his name is Marc Augé. That's Auge with an emphasis on it. And he's a French philosopher who came up with this concept of non-place.
Mhm.
And he said that places are defined as being relational or historical or having meaning. And then there are these things that are non-places, and that's the opposite, right? There are these sort of transitory, sometimes liminal spaces, but the meaning is not embedded in the place in the way that it should be. And motels and hotels are perfect examples of non-places. But again, it's a non-place for Marion and Lila, but it is a place for Norman, right? It's
Mhm.
in fact, it's the ultimate place. It is his home and his livelihood. And so again, this film brilliantly just sort of reminds you that, are you good for being a voyeur? Are you bad for being a voyeur? Yes, right? Like, are you in
Mhm.
the home or not in the home? Yes. Is this a home invasion narrative because he breaks into Marion's room? Or is this a home invasion narrative because Marion intrudes into Norman's home?
Is his isolation by choice, or is he here because, or is it for something else? Is running away any better than staying where you are and being isolated somewhere else in the case of Marion? It's all these really interesting binaries and situations that get set up, and how Hitchcock and the screenwriter set these up for a lot of dialogue where they'll like really and be running right to a clear solution, and then you ask one question and the whole thing falls apart. And it's horrifying for both of the characters. They're clearly both, everybody's clearly uncomfortable by this and this breaking in here. But particularly, Norman and obviously Marion are really uncomfortable by this. And so obviously that means Marion's got to go.
Yeah. When there are two uncomfortable characters, one of them has to be removed because then that's the irritant, right? Because he was, quote, fine until Marion arrived. And this is carried through until some of the final images of the film. So the spoilers that we promised are now about to happen, right? Mother and Norman. Is it Norman? Is it Mother? Yes. And that last superimposition before the final footage is actually of them removing the car from the bog. But that final superimposition where we have seen Norman, he's sitting there, and then we hear Mother's voice, and she's like, I wouldn't even harm a fly. And then we see his face, and we see her skull, and it sort of, superimposes onto each other, right? That is Hitchcock denying us in that final moment the opportunity to have any sort of neatly defined barriers or borders.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, it's clearly in that moment separating it from being in any relation to, like, I've seen this too, like the LGBTQ community or transgender issues, because they're not it's clearly this other persona that is taken over rather than being connected, as the film itself denies that as well. And because I've seen this film in conversation a lot with other films, like Silence of the Lambs, for its portrayal and this conversation around being a trans narrative or representative of that, or the fears around that. And I don't know, that just seems that I'm not even confident that I'm sure I would be willing to lump it in with that category either, because this film is so uncategorizable, it feels like.
And there's a lot of discussion about the sort of, quote, latent or repressed homosexuality of Norman. But the way that it's argued is with the, like, because you can't see it and because nothing in this film suggests it, therefore it's present, right? One of those sort of arguments. And I think, honestly, that has more to do with Anthony Perkins and his portrayal, and of course, who he was as a person embodying this role, than certainly what's in the film, because I don't think you get that impression at all in the Gus Van Sant version. So this film has been both criticized for that, but I know that there are also some people that have been like, hey, look, we have an early gay character, and yes, he doesn't do great things, but they don't blame him for being gay as for the reason that he's being bad, right? So I've seen this film being both appropriated and sort of vilified for again, the same subtext that is, we talked about subtext before, but this isn't even subtext. This is, I want this to be in there, so I'm going to make sure it's in there sort of reading.
And kind of, I guess, a combined, like a projection of like the information that's available about Anthony Perkins' personal life onto this fictional character that's been constructed, which is, it's an interesting reading, and it's certainly not ungrounded in reality, but it also is not 100% textually supported as well, which is just leads back to this larger thing of like, it's because it's not necessarily a positive or negative portrayal of it, like you're suggesting, because this film is just so much more complicated, and that's just one of the many areas.
One of the great things about this film is getting to experience it for the first time and not having any knowledge. So Hitchcock was able to do things that we just frankly wouldn't be able to do today, right? So he bought up as many copies of Bloch's book as he could prior. Can you imagine trying to do that now?
You couldn't get the ebook version off of the internet.
Yeah, I mean, it would be impossible. So. You'd have to be best friends with Jeff Bezos, I guess.
Yeah,
and like temporarily have it be suspended. I think that's what you'd have to do. You would have to be friends with Jeff Bezos and every other bookstore owner alive.
Yeah.
So since that's probably not going to happen, I doubt anyone will be able to do this again. But Hitchcock didn't want anyone knowing anything going into this film, so he bought the books that he could. He really did not let the cast do any interviews or things like that because he wanted it to be this sort of tightly guarded secret. And the result is that our leading lady, because even though she, quote, has to be punished maybe a little because she's in her bra and such, I mean, this is her leading lady, and she doesn't make it, right? And she doesn't make it pretty early into this film.
Yeah, I was shocked by that, so I had no idea that I knew that the shower scene was coming and that she was definitely going to die, but I guess in my mind I had always put that way later into the film, so when she died so early, my first thought was just like, well, where else is this film going to go? Because all of that conversation and this initial tension is all around this controversy of like Norman and Marion, and are they going to get out of their traps that they put themselves into? Are they going to be able to get this tension and resolve it? And the answer is no. They're not going to. They're going to take it out, and then the rest of it is figuring out why.
And not only are they going to not work out their tension, but Marion's not even going to know that there was tension to be had until it's too late.
Exactly.
Right? Like, this could have become a hostage situation type film or some sort of like domestic drama, right? But instead, before she even realizes that she is in danger, and she's decided, right, that to return. She's made that decision to return back to the city to return the money. And one of the really fascinating things is, seeing that we have this sort of red herring of, well, maybe she'll be punished because she stole the money, right? But that's not why she's being punished at all. Again, it just complicates the situation. But also, we just have to give props to Hitchcock for doing something that, Wes Craven and Kevin Williamson were going to do later in Scream, and that is to take a big A-list actor in Janet Leigh, mother of Jamie Lee Curtis, right? And being like, just kidding, we billed her as the top person, but she's out, just like, again, with Drew Barrymore. And that is incredibly effective and just kind of shocking, right? To do that, especially when you were the first one to do it. And
just the way that you're introducing all of these different red herrings, I particularly love the car scene in which she's driving on the highway and just you're hearing these voices in her head. And it's not ever confirmed whether these are voices actually happening outside in the real world that she's unable to hear, or if these are just voices in her head that she is imagining all of these things that could potentially happen and just being anxious. And I think it just adds to this tension because you can't know. It's Hitchcock denying you access into Marion's thoughts. Yeah. Or at least making you unsure.
Right. So Murphy talks specifically about the car, and I really like this passage. So she says, in a trope often seen in the highway horror film, the confines of the car act as an echo chamber for Marion's most neurotic imaginings. Hitchcock heightens this tension by keeping a tight close-up on Janet Leigh's face whenever she is behind the wheel, and by dramatizing Marion's panicky interior monologue. She has been alone with her thoughts for too long, a plight ironically echoed in that of her murderer-to-be, and the cracks are beginning to show. Her mental state is as fraught as Bernard Herrmann's desperately insistent score, which is the sound of primordial dread. Just as Marion finally begins to near her destination, she is blinded by heavy rain and by the headlights of oncoming traffic. Suddenly, her car slows down and the score comes to an abrupt stop. All we hear for a moment is the rattle of the rain as it ricochets off the windshield, until gradually, materializing into view, the neon sign advertising the Bates Motel can be seen. Marion's decision to stop is an impulsive act born out of physical and mental exhaustion. Had she not accidentally gotten off the main road, she would have reached Sam's hometown in 30 minutes. In the end, it is mere chance that brings her to the Bates Motel. Her roadside safe haven is, in fact, a death trap. And then she says, which will eventually become a very popular, familiar trope.
Yeah.
I love the way that Murphy writes because, one of the things that I think is really important in scholarship is to be doing close readings like that, where she's reminding us of the cinematography as well as the sound. And that is one of the things that I'm saddened that we do just an audio podcast, because it would be nice to like be able to play clips to remind people of things.
Yeah,
But I think we do have to talk about the fact that for all of his grossness, and he was a gross man, Hitchcock had a genius eye for cinematography and editing.
truly. There are just so many gorgeous shots. Like, you can also tell about this film that it was made very cheaply, but very efficiently. So that, because it's a very minimal amount of locations, and the set dressing is all incredibly simple. And so it's all in the execution of the shots and the editing composition that the film is able to work, because it's not a fancy film, and it didn't have a ton of money on it. It used a lot of the same crew and set members from previous projects just out of necessity. And so it really is just a testament to the commitment from everyone involved in the craft and composition of this film, that it's able to look as good as it does and hold up as well as it does. Like, I just watched it today in 2022, and we're like, what? That's 62 years later, and this film is, I feel, looks just as good, if not better, than films that are coming out today.
I think that's because, and you and I were talking about this just sort of in passing earlier today, that, certain things have stood up better than other things in terms of like CGI or things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that it has to do with remembering that these are tools rather than the product. And Hitchcock understood maybe better than anyone that cinematography is a tool to communicate whatever it is that you're hoping to accomplish. And there are a couple of scenes that just do this in a way that is still so profound. We talk about it today. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the really good examples, of course, is this shower scene. And it's funny because you mentioned that, like, ironically, the stuff that's made it into pop culture is as the just sort of like throwaway comments or references, particularly the like read and the knife stabbing,
The knife
is
stab,
like
yeah.
the least significant and meaningful component in many ways of the film.
Yeah, this film is really a long, disturbing, voyeuristic view of like exploring guilt and regret and isolation, and this tension between characters who feel very passive and stuck and isolated versus the active choices that they take to keep themselves in these situations and these private traps. And yet, the thing that's remembered about it is the like 2 times that it gets stabby in the shower, and then to a lesser extent when it's repeated again with the detective when he falls down the stairs. It's not necessarily wrong. They're amazing moments, cinematography-wise, editing-wise. Score is incredible. The performance.
So that's the thing, right? That the scenes that you referenced, we have pulled out in many respects the least interesting part, right? There are a couple of stabby motions, and that we have used to reference what is actually this incredible scene that has very little to do with penetration and stabbing. In fact, there's no penetration at all.
Mm-hmm.
There's no actual stabbing. In that 2-minute sequence, it consists of 78 camera shots and 52 different cuts.
Wow.
It took them a week to film. They did it on a close set so that for the parts that Janet Leigh was there, she was wearing something that was covering her various bits because she could, but it had to be skin colored. She had to be under that water forever. Hitchcock was incredibly cruel. He was an incredibly cruel man. In the film Rebecca, he purposefully told the lead actress that the main actor didn't like her and thought that she was talentless so that she would be more anxious to match her character. In Psycho, yeah. In Psycho, he purposefully made the water, and I can never remember if he made it really cold or really hot, but he purposely changed the temperature of the water to get her to make that scream, right? And so he treated all of his leading ladies like objects, and there's lots and lots of scholarship written on that. But the interesting things about Psycho are the things that are not happening. We don't have any penetration. We just have the allusion to it. This is what montage is at its best, right?
Mm-hmm.
Creating meaning out of a bunch of really meaningless shots, because it's a hand, and
Right.
then it's a curtain, and then it's a knife, and then it's a knife like pressed against the tummy, and then We have a graphic match where we have the circling of the bloody water down the drain with the circling of her dead eye. We
Mm-hmm.
have Hershey syrup being used for the blood to create that real sort of rich contrast.
Yeah.
And it was all of these details that make that scene so powerful. And in the Arbogast murder down the stairs, it is an equally complicated experience of zooming and
Mm-hmm.
tracking in different directions, right? To create that affect of him falling. And this is why we'll continue going back to Hitchcock, even though he was such a gross, just gross human. And this is why we continue to allude to him being an auteur, right? Like this single amazing person, when of course in actuality, it was his incredible team that helped him accomplish these things. Again, we have this desire because I think Psycho is too much to try to compartmentalize and to break it down into meaningful little nuggets
Mm-hmm.
rather than the complexity that it is.
Because I feel like the larger cultural understanding of this film really is only between this like Norman Bates and the Miss Crane conflict, and then which says nothing to the last 2/3 of the movie that's still left, with which has these like really fascinating search in trying to put all these complications of this mystery and trying to put it all together, which is one of my favorite parts of the film, was just getting to watch and unpack and go through this mystery with it, which is, I guess, of course, what Hitchcock and the screenwriter were so famous at doing.
Right, because we haven't really spent much time talking about Lila and Sam, but they're really fascinating characters because Sam is, by all intents and purposes, an adulterer. And if he's not an adulterer, he's at least having an affair, an extramarital affair.
Mm-hmm.
And that is our first impression of him, kind of coupled with the idea that like he's with Marion, right? And Marion has proven herself not to be perfect. So
Right.
therefore there must be something wrong with him. Otherwise, why wouldn't he? Right. But then we meet Sam and he's a really upstanding, decent guy. What could have easily become this sort of really disturbing romantic flair between him and Lila never happened. Instead, she was treated problematically, but treated as this like kid sister. But she also was like, no, actually, I kind of know how to solve things. Like, and
Mm-hmm.
she's a very competent character, a character that doesn't fit Hitchcock's sort of icy blonde, so she has a better chance at being respected in many respects. But those characters are profoundly interesting. But again, they kind of get pushed to the sidelines because they're not the scandalous bits, right? They're not the horror-y bits.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's what's so we've been talking, obviously, because this is a horror podcast, more on
Yes.
those other horror elements and this discussion of like, is Psycho, is it a horror? What did it shape the horror genre? But there are all these other elements that are super interesting, and someone else maybe, and they definitely have, and as you said, there are whole books written on it from a thriller perspective and all that. So it's really interesting and really been fun to, when I was watching this film, be looking for those horror elements and thinking of it in context of that horror framework, since that's what we talk about here.
Right. And I think the place that the film maybe tries explicitly to build that horror is, of course, I think what is the least interesting to you and I, and that is when we have the mansplaining at the end, which is hands down
Yeah.
always my least favorite part of this film, because this is such a good, clever film that has managed to communicate so much without having to give us those things, right? Like again,
Yeah.
we have the creation of a penetrating knife without the actual penetrating knife. And
Which
that
is
was more an issue of like him needing to get the Hays Code, right? And approval for ratings.
But it still is an amazing metaphor in of itself.
Yes.
We don't show the penetration because that's why Norman is doing the killing.
Yes.
So there will be no penetration.
Exactly, because he is punishing himself for wanting to, right? Like, but then it's just so brilliant. And then at the end, it's like, well, sons, gather around while I tell you about his mental condition. And I know that watching this now, we are familiar with another very problematic horror trope that I think Psycho gave us, and that is the mentally ill killer, right? And not just mentally ill, but someone that is slightly falling under, again, he's not, but like under the label of multiple personality or DID, where it's like this one person is encapsulating multiple people. So I know that this is one of the early texts giving us that really bad trope, but still, it just felt so clunky for a film that had been just
so
like
good.
soaring. Yeah.
It is one of those moments when that is why. So that with the ending is why another reason why this film could never comfortably be, I think, classified in the horror genre, because it so clearly just comes out and tells you exactly what's happened and why. Whereas in horror, I think one of the trademarks is that a lot of things just you kind of have to figure it out. The scary part is in the details that you're not quite sure of. Whereas this is clearly following in the footsteps of the mystery, the noir genre, and that detective speech in which, like, at the end, the detective, was he the detective? He was a psychologist.
No, he was the psychologist or psychiatrist.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, right, because the detective had to die because
he did.
he did the same thing as Marion.
Yes,
was challenging Norman.
Right, and in Norman's defense, which is a dubious thing to say, you could read Arbogast's action as a home invasion, right? Like no one invited him into the house. He comes in unannounced without permission, and then he goes up into. He doesn't even stay where you're allowed to stay as a guest, right? He goes upstairs into the inner sanctum, and that's So again, like, should we be feeling like this is a home invasion narrative for Norman, or is this a slasher for the Marion?
And that idea obviously is like seen later played out in like Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Yeah. And another element that we didn't necessarily talk about, but is also interesting and would get later rearticulated in Texas Chainsaw Massacre, is also the abandonment of industry because of the development of another new thing, which is a horrific element in of itself too, that would later be articulated and developed upon within the genre, but is just starting to emerge in this text through the Bates Motel being completely itself also isolated and cut off from the rest of the world, and because of development and human progress.
And this is why I have such a problem with that final speech, because what you just described is disaffirmative, right?
Right.
What is the problem? Society is the problem. Why do we feel like the highway system is not safe? Because it inherently isn't, because we've decided that we are willing to break down borders and boundaries, and yet we're surprised when there are negative consequences for literally scarring the landscape. We are surprised when there are consequences for what some people have described as forward mobility. And that to me is the most interesting parts of this narrative, this thinking about, like, do we actually even have the right to find motels disturbing, because we kind of made them be disturbing. But at the end, right, he's like, but don't worry, fine folks. This is a freak incident. This is a person who snapped, and it's all about, like, it's his fault, right? Like it's Norman that's the problem, but good news, we have safely contained him. And that's just, I didn't really expect anything different from Hitchcock. I don't think that was the type of film he was interested in making, was a sort of disaffirmative film. But that's where I think, for me, we lose out on again, that richness that he's been providing us all along.
And so maybe even this film is horror. It's just not necessarily the type of horror that either of us are all that interested in exploring, because I think I feel personally, at least, one of the frustrating things about the film and with that ending is that nice little bow that it ties up these really complicated things into. It really simplifies a lot of it into fitting more of a dualistic viewpoint, when it spent the whole film kind of exploring structurally why that was a limiting and unfair perspective to put on anybody.
And now, to completely contradict everything you and I just said, I'm going to say that at the same time, there's the potential for something really fascinating in that the final footage of the film is the car being removed from the bog, right? This idea that the things we bury, the actions that we have, we can keep them buried for a little while, but eventually all of our dirty secrets are going to come back. And so, again, the film, it gets real close, but it just is missing, for, like you said, for you and me, what we think horror ought to be, which, who are we to go against Hitchcock?
Yeah, and if at the very least, even if it's not entirely the horror that we like, it's certainly horror worth exploring. It was super interesting for me to get to watch for my first time, and I'm so glad that we were able to talk about it on here from this horror perspective, because there's a lot to unpack and a lot to like in it.
Well, that is our discussion of Psycho. I'm really glad, Toni, that you suggested we do it. I know that we're trying to think of ways that we can be talking about some of the older films that helped define many of the newer films that we love so much. And I think this was a great sort of first entry into a pre-1970s, because we've only done 1970s onward films, a pre-1970s horror film.
I found it really enriching just because, like, it was so interesting to kind of, as you mentioned, most of our ponderings and discoveries, at least on the podcast, and the research that we did together, and for the class that I was a peer tutor for with you, was mostly 70s and onward. So it's so interesting to go back and see something earlier and see the elements and how they emerge in the films onward. It's so cool.
Toni, what are we going to be looking at next?
So we went back to the 60s, and now we're going to go all the way 40 years into the future to the 2000s and talk about Scream 3.
Yay. I've really been enjoying all of our franchise investigations, but the Scream one is exciting for me, and I'll be excited to hear your thoughts, because hands down, out of the 5 Scream films, Scream 3 is my least favorite. So
interesting.
So I'll be excited to hear your thoughts about it. So people should be rewatching Scream 3 before our episode. What else should they be doing?
Well, you can always get in touch with us via our social medias in the description. Let us know on there what you think of this episode. What did you think about Psycho? Is it horror? Is it thriller? What are your least favorite things about us? Let us know. You can also email us to let us know future episodes, what you'd like to hear us talk about, and go to wherever you get your podcasts. And if you enjoyed this episode, give us a 5-star rating. It really helps us connect with other horror fans out there.
I want to thank Jackson O'Brien, who is editing this podcast episode and who edited our previous episode too. Yeah, the happiest day of my life was not having to edit an episode for the first time, and also having such a great job done. So thank you so much, Jackson, and to the other Such a Nightmare interns, Anna and Kai. Thank you so much for all of your help. And to you, the listeners, thank you for listening to our nightmares.
And have a spooktacular day.